All right, welcome everyone. So today's session with Joanne is the principles of retention in Microsoft 365, 5 essentials before you start. Welcome, Joanne. So you can take it away.
All right, thank you. Hi everyone. Thanks for sticking around. I know this is getting late in the day, so I'm happy there's as many people as I see in the meeting, so that's awesome. Okay, just momentarily, I want to get my clicker pointed in the right direction. There we go. Shout out to the sponsors for today's event. Thank you to them for providing some of the prizes and pulling this all together. Much appreciated. You've probably seen this if you have been on previous sessions. If you can submit your feedback for my session, it not only helps me, but it also gives you a chance to win a $50 Amazon gift card. Important number in the top corner is my code that associates this with this particular session. So please fill that out. I am Joanne Klein, and I am from Saskatchewan, and I'm thrilled to be part of the Canadian Cloud Summit. Always like to talk to fellow Canadians and beyond. If you're not from Canada, I don't know where everyone's from, but I spend most of my time in the advanced compliance features of Microsoft 365. All of my customers are seeking my expertise in those areas, and I blog about those areas as well. So you can follow me on joannecklein.com, and you can get a smattering of different data protection, data retention type of blogging on there. Oh, I see there's somebody here from Saskatchewan. Awesome. So my experience covers a wide swath of features in the Compliance Center. This is why I'm here talking to you today about one of them, which is data retention. I have a very deep SharePoint background, which I've discovered is fairly helpful, particularly when it comes to document management inside SharePoint and OneDrive. So I'm going to be showing you and some of the key essentials that are helpful to know about. Definitely helps if you have an understanding of SharePoint and search specifically within there. So site and information architecture, really a part of this for sure. And, the knowledge domain of compliance spans many different industries. So I have worked with customers in all of those industries. But by and large, although the regulations are different and some are much more stringent than others, it's the same constructs behind the scenes, just maybe implemented in a bit different way, and maybe have different gaps depending on what it is you're trying to meet. So the principles of retention, this is my 5 essentials I came up with. This is not Microsoft's, but although the principles of retention are a very important part of knowing when a piece of content is going to be deleted, before you even get there, you need to have a pretty solid understanding of the building blocks that you can use and leverage from the Compliance Center before you can lay on the principles of retention rules on top of them. That's what this session is all about. It's just from my experience in the field, areas that I feel maybe some customers don't realize that it's really important to know these things. So your takeaway from this is just have a good solid understanding of these 5, and then you won't get into trouble, presumably. I always 100% of the time get asked licensing. So I have bumped up the licensing section. This is not one of the 5, by the way, but I want to call it out because it is a primary concern to customers on all of the things I'm going to talk about. There is, of course, a license implication. So I'm going to point you in the direction of 2 excellent resources. The first one being by, he's actually a Microsoft employee in Australia, but he did a website on his own to really slice and dice, if you will, all of the different license SKUs for Microsoft, particularly in the security and compliance space, and what you get with each one of the different licenses. Then the official Microsoft resource is aka.ms/compliancesd, and there's an image of a PDF you can download that gives you all of the different capabilities per license. So I've snipped out the piece that we're going to talk about today, that being information governance. I want to point out the bottom bit because I get asked this quite a bit. Some of the services, and particularly in information governance, they can't limit it to specific users. So the onus, I guess, is on you as the customer to decide which of your users need the license and which don't. So you can't have a library that a whole bunch of people have access to, and only 3 of those people have the license, and you want those 3 people to apply the label. That's not how it works. You need to have everybody with access to that library having the license. That's just an example. This is my high-level summary. If it's manual, it likely will be available in the E3 license. If it requires some kind of automation, an adaptive scope, an auto-apply label, event-based retention, that's considered an automation. It typically requires either full E5 or one of the compliance kind of add-on SKUs. And what I mentioned before, all users benefiting from the service require the license. So not sure if that kind of clears it up for you. Licensing can be a bit of a bear to deal with, but that was my kind of addressing it right up front. Just wanted to call this out. I won't dwell on this much. Because SharePoint syntax models is one way to get a retention label and a date sensitivity label actually on a piece of content, it's relevant here. It has a different licensing model. It's licensed separately, so I just wanted to call that out. All right, essential number 1 for retention. You must understand the actions that retention policies and retention labels can take. So that sounds pretty simple, but you'd be amazed how many people don't really get the nuances of this. First of all, you don't even have to retain or delete. And I asked on Twitter the other day what people are using this for. And by and large, people are using it for testing out an auto-apply label condition. You can have a label, use the same condition you would with a real label, but it doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't do any retaining. It's not going to do any deleting. It's a safe way of testing out your auto-apply. When you're done your test, you remove it out of the policy, you delete the label, and then it will delete it from any content in which it was applied on. So a great use case for that. Another one is you can just retain only. So either retain and do nothing at the end of it, or retain forever. That would be 2 examples of a retain only. In the colored boxes, I'm showing examples of either a retention policy or a retention label. I'll talk about the differences of that in a minute, on that particular action to help clear it up a bit. And retain and delete. So you can have a retention policy that applies to maybe Teams chats for executives and then deletes it after with no review. Or maybe you want to have a review and so you have to use a retention label. Maybe you have one for contracts and then delete them after a certain period of time. Or maybe not quite so obvious, you can have a retention policy that doesn't retain at all. In fact, all it does is delete after a period of time. And I often see this with Teams chats, where organizations believe Teams chats to be a liability in some cases, so they want to get rid of them after a fairly short period of time. You can go down as low as 1 day, as a matter of fact. And it doesn't prevent users from deleting them earlier because there's no retention component, but it will ensure they're deleted after your expiration period. And then you can also do this with retention labels, although I don't see that used in that manner very often. Okay, essential number 2. Some of these essentials are bigger than others, so I will move along. Essential number 2 is understand the differences between a retention policy and a retention label. Completely different retention mechanisms, each serving a different purpose. So here is the tactical differences between them. Retention policy is applied at a container or location level, an entire site, an entire team, an entire mailbox. Retention label is at an item level, email, folder, document. Retention policy, end user is unaware it's there. They can have a retention policy on their Exchange mailbox. They would be able to add, change, and delete email. It's being preserved in the back end, but they're unaware that's going on. Retention label is in the UI. End users can interact with it in most cases, apply it, remove it in most cases, and it can also be auto-applied. Big difference, particularly if you need, if you're a regulated organization and you need a disposition review before a piece of content can be deleted. You can only have that if there's a retention label on the particular item. You cannot have it on a retention policy side. Things are just deleted at the end of the retention policy if you have it configured to delete. There can be a bit more what's called immutability, in that a piece of an item can have more stricter controls around what can be changed. If you have a retention label applied to it, there's different types of labels. Can't have that at all on the retention policy side. It's just retaining it. And you can start retention on different types of dates. You can see you have more options on the retention label side than you do on the retention policy side. And differences in where these two can be published. So a retention policy, once published to a location, applies to all content within the location. Retention label policy is also published, but can be auto-applied, because remember, we're talking about a granular label, and it's applied not at a container level, but to specific items within the location. So if you published it, if you wanted to apply retention label to content in a document library, you would have to publish it to the site first and then default everything in that document library to have that retention label. So the difference between published and auto-applied on the retention label policy: published labels end users will see in that detail pane for a document in SharePoint, let's say, in the label dropdown. If a label has been auto-applied, they in fact won't see that in there to select, unless you've also published it to the site. But if it's just being auto-applied by an auto-apply label policy, they won't see it. So some nuanced differences between those, for sure. Essential number 3, understand the behavior differences between retention label types. So remember, I talked about immutability of a piece of content, and records managers often need to have different degrees of immutability depending on the type of content that it is. So the retention label type is chosen when you're defining or creating your retention label. You get one chance at this. You cannot change the type once it's been created. This is why lots of planning goes into defining the retention labels in your file plan in the Compliance Center. So regular label, what I call regular label, or just regular retention label. There's a record label if you've got that first tick box checked, or a regulatory record label. As you can see, regulatory record, you have to enable this feature by PowerShell still, I believe, and it is a very tightly controlled way of marking an item as being completely immutable. You can't remove the record, the regulatory record label after you've applied it. Even if you're a records administrator or a global admin, it is there on that record. That's the reason for it, is because there are some regulations like the Security and Exchange Commission that require this level of immutability. They want assurance that that label cannot be removed from that record, because a records administrator can remove a record label off of a record. They have permission to do so. So there's different levels of control across each of these. Really important to explain this to the records management team in your org so they understand the nuances between them. Now, Microsoft, I have this in the links at the end of the presentation. Microsoft has documented this kind of in a one-page grid on what you can do with an item that has that particular type of label on it. The stars on here are just to highlight some recent changes Microsoft has pushed out for tenant level settings that will control whether you can do this or not, and some functionality around it. So records managers will have access to kind of a tenant level records management settings that can control some of these things. So I will talk about that. But you can see a container admin would be like a site collection admin. They have control to do certain things. So they need to understand what they can and cannot do. And, you know, this is part of your governance model across your organization, because there are going to be non-records managers that are going to have the ability to do these things, group owners, for instance. So it's important. They're also the data custodians of their particular area. So it's really important that they understand the data, the proper data handling controls for the content that's in there. So recently there was a change that at the tenant level, you could turn off this setting you're seeing. You may have run into this. If you tried to delete a document that had a retention label on it, you would be prevented from doing so. You'd have to remove that retention label if in fact you wanted to delete it. Microsoft has now rolled out worldwide a tenant level setting to allow this to be deleted, but it'll preserve it in a special library on the SharePoint site. So it's actually not deleted, but it will, you know, allow the end user to delete it. It will go through the recycle bin process. So these retention label settings, fairly new. This is a tenant level setting. So you can't have one setting for one site and a different setting for another site. This is at the tenant level. So records managers have to really give some thought on how they want these settings and the end user behavior to be. So you can, this is the one I was just talking about, where you can allow end users to delete labeled content out of OneDrive and SharePoint or not, show them that error message. Record versioning will, right now you have to unlock a record to make changes to the document. So this is basically turning that off, not allowing changes to a record, not allowing you to unlock it. And right now, if you have a record label on a piece of content, on a document, you don't have to unlock it to change any metadata that's on that document. Some records managers didn't like that because they wanted to make sure they didn't change any metadata either. So this, in fact, will allow you to prevent users from editing those record properties. Okay, so takeaway from this is work with your records managers to find the right configuration for your organization. Because this is tenant level, if you have the luxury of a demo tenant to try this out with and show you know, your records management team what this is like, or if you haven't rolled out retention labels yet in your production tenant, you can turn this on, fire up a test site and see how this works. So, but again, the takeaway from this, tenant level. Essential number 4, understand all the ways to apply a retention label. This is where knowledge of SharePoint and search definitely helps if you're going to use some of these techniques. Okay, so this is kind of a busy diagram, but if we work our way from left to right, it shows all of the ways to apply a retention label. You can see some are automated. Many, those kind of dark blue boxes are all of the different ways you can automate putting a particular retention label on an item. You can manually apply it. So when you publish a bunch of retention labels to a SharePoint site, let's say an end user picks it, just like they pick a piece of metadata to apply that retention label. You can default it. So default it at a library, at a folder, at a document set, if you're familiar with that concept at a SharePoint. And once it's labeled, then the configuration you have for your retention label then defines the parameters and the conditions in which that piece of content is retained and or deleted. Okay, so those are the light blue kind of definition of the label. So what I'm circling there in red is the only ability you have with an E3 license. Anything that's automatically applied or defaulted at a library folder or document set level does require an elevated compliance license. When I say elevated compliance license, I'm saying either E5 or one of the add-on license SKUs. And in green circled is really where a lot of the, if you have one of those extra licenses and you want to leverage some of the SharePoint information architecture you already have in your environment, this is where your knowledge of SharePoint and SharePoint Search definitely will help you. So if you're not one of those people, I don't know who, what the roles are of the people in here, but work with your SharePoint information architects, along with your records managers, kind of bring those two worlds together to figure out how you can automate some of this, some of these retention requirements for your end users. So I'm just going to show you a smattering of the ways a label can be put on a piece of content. Not all of them, because we don't have that much time today. So you can default a library in SharePoint, requires elevated license, and you can do this after the fact. So there could already be content inside a library if you want, and you set the default for that library. New documents uploaded will inherit this label by default. Important thing to know, once a piece of content has a retention label on it, it cannot be overwritten. Even if you have an auto apply label policy that has a condition that would be met by metadata on that document, it can't be overwritten. So that's the way it works now. I'm not sure if there's anything in the works for that to change, but if you're doing any kind of design, this is definitely a factor that goes into your design for sure. When I see somebody won the gift card, yay, Natalie, congrats, Natalie. Okay, so you can default a folder. Where I've seen this done in a financial services company, or you could do this for any finance department. Finance teams are typically very organized in a folder structure, fiscal year, fiscal quarter, fiscal month, that kind of thing. This suits that, particularly if maybe you've got a retention requirement for some of the content in there based on fiscal year. This is where I would use something like this. So you can set a retention label at a folder level. One of the few times folders are awesome in SharePoint. So here I'm setting financial info as the folder retention label. If I go inside of here, automatically everything inherits that. Okay, so end user doesn't have to do it, happens by default. Okay. The concept of a content type, big in SharePoint, it defines different kinds of content you might have. You can have additional metadata to further describe the piece of content. This has been around for years, not new. If you have any business process automation going on in SharePoint, you likely are already leveraging content types and the myriad of metadata you might have on all of them. So you can also use this for assigning a retention label. So here's an example of looking at the content type, based on the content type value, slap a retention label on it. I'm calling out these two variations because, and here's where the knowledge of SharePoint and search comes into play. In the search index, that's actually what you're searching against when you do these KQL queries. The value of content type and SP content type are different. So you need to know that if you are searching the top one, content type, and then the colon means I'm looking for the content type name. It just has to be contained anywhere in the string. The equal sign is I want it to exactly match. So depending on what you're looking for and what the content type is, you would use either one or the other. So the values on the bottom are meant to kind of highlight what you're searching against to make sure you get your search exactly right for that retention label. Okay, so a use case for this would be project documents. Maybe we have a content type called project documents. We could have automated this in a provisioning solution for project sites, maybe made the default content type on the main shared documents library, project document. Lots of ways we can get this content type in the library. But you know, that's kind of outside of the scope of this conversation. Let's just assume we have a content type of project document. So how we would use that to our benefit of applying a retention label would be ensure you have that content type set up consistently across your project sites. That's why a site provisioning solution makes that immensely easier and, you know, scalable. And then you create your label that you want to auto apply with whatever retention requirements is in the retention schedule for your organization. So once you've done that, we're going to auto apply it. And we're going to put in a KQL or keyword query language query to pick up all of those content types. So this follows a very common syntax. Name it. You say, where do you want to auto apply this? And because I'm in this fictitious scenario, I'm controlling what kind of sites, project sites are. They're just going to be SharePoint sites in this case. They're not going to be Microsoft 365 groups. That's where I auto apply this. So wait for the retention label to be applied up to 7 days. In this case, it was 4 days later, and you can see I've got different kinds of content types in this library, but project was only applied for the project document content types. And you can see this was applied, this was a couple years ago, this works exactly the same way today. The only thing you got to be careful with is you have that query right, either SP content type or content type. And you can test that out in content search, in Microsoft search, and in the SharePoint search query tool, if you're familiar with that. All right, next you could auto apply based on some metadata. So that this is, again, is other SharePoint information architecture that has been around for a long time. There are some caveats to this. The column types that I've used and have had success with are there on the bottom. So manage metadata, I have a little asterisk beside that, is because I've only had success when I define that as a tenant level manage metadata column. In other words, from the content type hub. And on the calculated column, actually, no, that's not right. I think it has to be a tenant level term set. And the calculated column, I was just asked this question the other day, and I published a blog post yesterday on if you can use a calculated column for an auto apply condition of a label. And yes, you can, but there's some constraints. And the reason there's some constraints, it goes back to SharePoint search and what's actually stored in the search index, which is what you're querying against. And calculated columns can be 5 different kinds of data types, but no, doesn't matter which one you picked, they're all stored as strings, as you can see, in the search index. So you have to be a little bit careful if you want to use one of these. You can absolutely use a calculated column if it's single line of text. You can use Boolean. Can't use date and time because it's in fact not a date and time stored. It's a string. And you probably could use number if you were looking for an exact number. So look on my blog for a blog post about that if you're interested in doing that. Use case for this, something like corporate policies. So you can do a date comparison. So imagine we had a piece of metadata on a library called expiry date. Once it has expired, i.e. it's before today, then we want to do something. We want to maybe put a retention label on it. You can do compound conditions. So maybe we have different kind of retention labels for corporate policy versus a corporate procedure, let's say. So we wanted to compound the condition and apply a retention label based on 2 things together instead. So how we would do that is we would add our metadata to our library. Again, the site provisioning solution would be a scalable way of doing this. You need to map that to a managed property that's queryable in the search index. This is where knowledge of how the search schema and the search index in SharePoint helps immensely. Once you've done that and you've tested your query, then you can use it in an auto apply condition. Define your retention labels for whatever your retention requirement is in your retention schedule. So I've got corporate policy, retention label, and I want to auto apply it. I'm going to pick that. I'm going to put in this case, I'm just putting in refinable date 00 is less than today. So I have mapped my expiry date crawl property to that refinable date managed property. And I'm applying this to all the SharePoint sites. That's a static scoped policy, by the way. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Wait for retention label to apply 4 days later. So I've done some view formatting in this view. At the time this demo was recorded, the pink highlighted dates were in the future, the yellow ones were in the past. So you can see it only applied corporate policy when the date has passed. It ignored it if there was no date, and if it was in the future, it didn't apply it. So this is a good use case for applying a label on expired policies, as long as you're consistently setting that expired date. Okay, you could auto apply based on a trainable classifier. This is fairly new. This is an advanced license feature. Microsoft recently announced 9 new business trainable classifiers. I've got them circled in blue below. And I really like these because this is content. It really aligns with, many of the industry verticals. You can probably relate to a lot of the content that would be mapped to those. So this is their description for each of those trainable classifiers, the type of content that it looks for a match. So this is based on thousands and thousands of documents that they have used to train the trainable classifier. And they provide it to everybody in their tenant, and you can use it. And there's actually a feedback mechanism to tell them, if it's working or not. They want to really fine tune this over time. So on my own tenant, because I run my own consulting company, so I have my own tenant. I have statements of work in there. So I thought I'm going to pick the agreements business trainable classifier and try to auto apply a retention label to all the SOWs in my environment. I thought that would be a pretty good test. So it worked flawlessly, and I didn't fudge any of the data. I just thought I'm just going to throw it at this and see what it does. So I was pretty impressed that it was able to pick out of a bunch of documents which ones were the statements of work and apply the appropriate retention label to it. So you can go to joanneklein.com/TC retention to see that blog and the blog post. Okay, you can auto apply using SharePoint syntax. Remember, I talked about SharePoint syntax up at the front for licensing. This is yet another way does much more than retention. It automatically classifies content. So it can set a content type, it can set the metadata, it can also set a retention label. So it is built in a content center, and there's a couple of different models. So what I'm showing you here is the document understanding model. Once you build this, you define, I'm not going to show you how to build it just for time's sake, but you define the content type that relates to the model, all of the metadata that you want to extract out of a document, and then the retention label you want to apply. And once you've defined that, you publish it to libraries across your tenant, basically. So as you can see here, you can set the retention label. So I'm setting a new model called SOW, and I'm going to set financial info retention label. So the retention label must be previously created already. I want to set the financial info retention label when there's a match. So here is the finished SOW model, and you can see the entity extractors are the 4 columns I'm going to pull out of a document. So I'm ready to add a library to this. So I'll publish this model to a library. So I just pick a site, the shared documents library in that site. I'm going to add all of the entity extractors as columns in the default view. So it's going to show up by default, and then I'm publishing it to this site. So now that it's published to this site, we can go to the library. Whenever we upload documents into this site, the model will run against all of the documents. So I'm uploading some false SOWs and some real SOWs to see if it can figure out the difference. You can see the columns that it automatically added to the view because we told it to. So it takes a while, as in under 5 minutes, I would say, for the model to run against all of the content. And I'm really, really impressed with Syntax because it's spot on. It pulled all of those pieces of metadata out of each of those documents based on the way I had defined it in the document understanding model. And as you can see, also set the retention label. So work with your compliance admins to find out when you're re-engineering some of those business processes in your organization, make sure you're considering compliance from the get-go and retention label. And I think document understanding also does a sensitivity label. I don't think the other model form understanding does yet, if I have that right. So lots of controls you can put on these things using the syntax model. Okay, so essential number 5 is understand how to scope your retention policies and labels. This is a fairly new advancement from Microsoft on scoping where you want policies and labels to be applied to. So if you remember this diagram from essential number 2, I think it was, where we talked about the differences between a retention policy and a label policy and the locations they can be published to. Well, a retention scope basically controls which of those locations a policy applies to. So which mailbox, which team, which group, which SharePoint site. So it can be static, which is what we've used up to this point in time. And the demos I've showed you up to now all used a static scope, or it can be what's called adaptive. So you will see this as a new option now when you're creating a policy, either a retention policy or a label policy. You will be prompted to decide if it's adaptive or static. So static is you specify a static list of locations that you want your retention policy or label policy applied to. So it can apply to everything, so all mailboxes, all Teams chats, or you can include or exclude certain locations, outside of the all. So maybe you want to exclude just the executive Teams chats, but include everybody else's. However, as you can see on the third bullet, the onus is on you as the admin to keep those locations up to date. So if you are, going back to my example, if you are excluding executive mailboxes, it's on you as your executive team changes to be adding and removing executives from that scope. So that's a fairly heavy IT administrative burden, I would say. And it's also subject to some limits. And on the right-hand side, you can see in a policy, these are the limits that you can have. Doesn't mean you can have more than this, but you have to have multiple policies to accommodate that. However, there is still definitely a use case for statically scoped policies. So a couple of them is, and I see this used often, organizations have a retention policy to automatically delete Teams chats after a certain period of time. That would be a static policy. You just want to apply it to all Teams chats. Or if you have a very small number of those inclusions or exclusions that are fairly static, they maybe change a little bit, but not a lot. It's manageable, in other words. So that's where a static scope still is the appropriate choice. Adaptive is new since last October, and the power of it is it will automatically update inclusions and exclusions based on conditions that you provide. So of course, it provides a lot more flexibility across your policies, allows for very complex retention requirements on what areas and what locations things apply to, and it removes the limits, which is a big one, particularly for large organizations. Works well for large and or regional organizations. If you're a global company and you have different regulations for different countries or different regions, this would allow you to have different policies published based on the region in which the mailbox is user is in or the Microsoft 365 group has been associated with. Capstone retention model is a model where maybe the executive roles or higher roles in your organization have different retention requirements than everybody else. This model works well for that. And if you have mature governance, and I will talk about what I mean on that, this does rely on the underpinning of a few things in your back end that you will soon see. So requires upfront planning, yes, to know what type of adaptive scope to create, and second, how to build your query and the conditions for including or excluding different locations. So can you have both a static and an adaptive scope retention policy published to the same location? Absolutely, yes, you can. Which, by the way, this is why we need the principles of retention. So an example of where I see this is have a static scope to automatically delete Teams chats for all users after 30 days, but have also an adaptive scope, but only published to the executives to retain their Teams chats for 1 year before deleting. So this is an example where in an executive Teams chats, they actually have 2 retention policies published to their Teams chats, but because of the principles of retention, it's the adaptive scope that would be adhered to in this case. So there's 3 types of adaptive scopes. Really important to understand these, particularly as an IT admin and a records manager, on which one is going to be appropriate for you when you're building out your policies. Users, and this is where the mature organizational governance comes in place. I'm talking about how clean is your Azure AD when I say this. How good is your onboarding and your offboarding process for, and even moving between teams and regions, is your Azure AD environment getting updated appropriately? You can have a Microsoft 365 Groups adaptive scope, also based on Azure AD attributes, particularly if you have a groups provisioning process where you are setting custom attributes, let's say, for region or country or department. You could leverage that and have an adaptive scope just purpose-built for including them. And SharePoint Sites adaptive scope, heavy reliance on knowledge of search and KQL in order to, first of all, set a property at a SharePoint site level. There again, SharePoint site provisioning is your friend here to be able to do that when you're figuring out how you're laying out your SharePoint site architecture in your tenant. And then there are properties in the search index, so then you can leverage them to either include or exclude sites. So I just wanted to share with you some of the properties. There's a simple and an advanced query builder for all of these 3. Of course, the simple one is through the GUI and you get a limited set of attributes. But in all cases, you can get into the advanced query builder and have a more robust list of properties that you can query on, in this case, Azure AD. So based on these properties, and that's the supported retention location. So remember, we're looking at the user in this case, including or excluding users. On groups, again, out of the box, those are the attributes you can use. You can see some custom attributes in there that you might want to be populating, or maybe you already are populating. And then once you have the list, you can apply retention, either policy or labels to those locations. And on the SharePoint site side, there's a dependency on SharePoint search, and also on you having put a site property in SharePoint. You can't do this in the UI. This does require updating properties in the SharePoint site property bag. So if you have a developer that's working with you, building a SharePoint site provisioning solution, they would know how to do that. And then you can use search to filter your list of sites in a very targeted and specific way. So to highlight this, I'm going to walk through one of these. Now, just for sake of time, I have a click-through demo on all 3 of these. Number 2 and number 3, I'm leaving in the take back to the work from home office section at the end of this presentation. You can click through and see how to do this. For this presentation, I'm just going to walk through number one. It's a similar model for all three. The SharePoint one is a little bit different, of course, but number one and number two are very similar. So this is the requirement that you may be given from a records manager. So maybe they want to publish a unique set of labels to executive users only and apply a retention policy to automatically delete their team's chats after 10 days. So how I would do this is I would look to see how can we identify an executive user in Azure AD. So for this particular demo, in this demo tenant, I've got 3 users that have a department of executive management. So I'm imagining that's how I'm defining it in my particular tenant. It uses something called OPATH to query against Azure AD, and using Exchange Online PowerShell, you can see I'm filtering the user mailbox looking for that specific department. And in this case, I've got Deborah, Patty, and Adele. So I've got 3 users that are considered executive, and I want to do something specific to those 3 users. Don't show it here, but Microsoft has also provided a script, a little pop-up box on GitHub for you to enter your query and to get the results back as well, which would be a good idea if you're in a very large tenant and you have thousands of users coming back, because you can export it to CSV and validate you're in fact got the right set of users. You want to make sure your query is exactly spot on before you do this, because if you're going to use the results of this to apply retention labels or apply a retention policy, you want to make sure you're doing this for the right users. So when we create the scope, this is a new option under either information governance or records management in the Compliance Center. So we're going to build an executive management user scope. You can see here, here's the 3 types. You need to pick which kind of scope that you want to build. We want to build a user's scope, selecting the specific Azure AD attributes to match. So I could use the simple query builder in here just by a set of drop downs, but I'm going to go into advanced query builder and just put in the filter part of my OPATH query, which is, in this case, department equals executive management. In here, there's no way to validate the query. That's why you need to use PowerShell or that script tool that Microsoft has provided to validate it before you get to this point. Right, once it creates the scope, you can see here the adaptive scopes. It takes about a day for it to do its thing and for this to cook, as they say, and for you to see which users does it think is included in this scope. So when you click it, after about a day, there's something called scope details on the bottom. And if you look at that, it will have all of the users, in this case, that were added and considered to have an executive department, executive management department. You can say they're all a state of added. What would happen is if maybe one of them left and was removed, this is constantly running in the background. So you would see maybe if Adele left, it would show Adele removed. So this is the adaptive nature of this scope. And this is why the onus is no longer on you to do it. As long as you have your query right, this will be an up-to-date current list of the users that meet this particular query. Okay, so if we get back to the requirement, we need to publish a set of labels to the executive users. So how do we do that? Well, we go into the records management section and we create 4 labels, let's say in this case, and we haven't published them anywhere. So you can see I've already got that defined, and I select them all and then I say publish. And you have to say, well, where do you want to publish them? And I want to pick my new adaptive scope. So I say add scope and I find the user scope that I just built for executive management. I want this to apply to not only their Exchange email, but also their OneDrive account. So this is optional for you on what you want to do. It doesn't have to be both. Name the policy and publish it. So after about a day, in my case, it was less, particularly on the OneDrive side, executive users will see these retention labels in their OneDrive sites and in their Outlook email because they've been published to them. I haven't auto-applied them. So I'm Adele. I'm one of the executives. If I'm in my OneDrive and I select a document and I go in here, you can see I've got the special exec dash retention labels published to me, in addition to other labels that have been published to me through other policies. But because I'm an executive, I also have those. Okay, so that's how this works. The next part of the retention requirement was automatically delete their Teams chats after 10 days. So how we would do that is define a retention policy targeting their chats. So I go into the retentions policy section of information governance. I create a new policy. I pick adaptive, so I'm going to pick the exact same scope because remember, we want this going against just executive users. So you can use these scopes over and over again, or use multiple scopes within a policy if you want. So here I'm just selecting Teams chats. I'm giving my retention requirement, so I'm saying delete them when they're 10 days old. Creates the policy. So executive users Teams chats will be automatically deleted after 10 days. Of course, there's not a retention component on this. This goes back to essential number 1. This does not preclude an executive user from deleting a Teams chat before 10 days because there's not a retention component. So this is a key difference, a nuance between them. So you need to know what to configure in the back end. Okay, so back on the take back to the work from home office section at the end of this is the one I have clicked through for the Microsoft 365 group. So it's different groups associated to different countries, Canada, USA in this case, and they have different retention requirements for their Teams channel messages and files. So I walk through that. And then the SharePoint site click through is auto applying retention labels to content on concluded legal matter SharePoint sites, something I've done with a customer of mine. So they didn't want the retention labels applied to the content until the legal matter was concluded. So this required putting a property at the SharePoint site level in order for me to know that the legal matter was concluded. So in this case, they had a legal matter site for every legal matter. Okay, so there's the 5 principles. We're now at the principles of retention. So the reason I like to do that is because there's no sense talking about the principles of retention unless you have a good understanding of your retention requirements. You understand the 5 essentials we just talked about to decide how you're going to deploy your retention label policy and your retention policies across your tenant. Once you've done that, the principles of retention then determine the action to take on each item. And this is, in fact, what makes you compliant or not compliant. So when you get an audit it's determined that you're keeping things for longer than you should, it's because potentially something hasn't been configured right in the back end. So it's the principles that will, in fact, delete a piece of content when it should or hang on to it for as long as it should. They're necessary because more than one retention label and label policy can be published to the same location at once. I gave that example of the Teams chats retention, right, for the executive users. So they're the rules that really determine how long a piece of content is retained and or when it's deleted. So the only thing that can override your retention policies and label policies is a legal hold. A legal hold, whether it be done for litigation reasons or there's an internal investigation or there's some other regulatory requirement or audit that's going on, a legal hold basically stops everything. So it's just kind of in stasis while that process is going on. Once the legal hold is lifted, everything just kind of resumes again. Here's the principles, level 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's not that many of them. It's basically a tie-breaking flow. So you start at level 1 And if you look at all of the retention policies, and if there's a label on the item, the settings of that label, and you do the comparison, if there's a winner, you stop. And that's the thing that wins, and you don't carry on. So what I have done, because there was quite a bit of confusion is maybe a strong word, but just not quite knowing how this all worked together, I put together a not a contest, just a challenge, if you will, of 5 or 6 different scenarios. And I got people to say which principle they thought won. So I will go over that, give you the link at the end. So if you're wondering, I feel free to do that. One thing I want to point out is there's a new feature called policy lookup to help you know, in fact, which retention policies and label policies are published to a site or a user, because in large tenants, as you get more and more of these policies, it gets challenging to do it without PowerShell. So there's something called policy lookup in records management, where you can do a lookup on user, site, or group, and you can see everything that has been published to them. So I'm putting in a URL to a site. And this is my test tenant, so it has a ridiculous number of policies published to it. But you can see these are all of the policies published to that one site. This is why the principles of retention are required. So due to time, I probably won't go through these, but there's, I think, 3 or 4 different examples I've got of retention, scenarios, what level wins in the principles of retention. Here's some deletion examples, combined examples, because you can have some that do both retention and deletion, and more. So won't go through them. Here is a link to the challenge on my blog, the reference from Microsoft, and Microsoft has even put together a flow chart. Now, it's a fairly complicated flow chart, which I believe speaks to how complicated this can get, on the rules that the algorithm they use to determine what rule wins and where a piece of, why a piece of content should be retained or deleted. So if you're questioning something, I would definitely go to that flow chart and kind of walk through the steps of their algorithm for your particular scenario and use case, and see what would happen with a piece of content. All right, so that's all I had. Thank you very much. So I will leave this here just to thank the sponsors again, and I'm just looking to see if there's any questions from the group. I didn't see any, but it was hard for me to look. All right. Oh, I see thank you for hand clapping. That's great. Yeah, so please, getting back to those click-through demos, just for sake of time, I didn't have time to do those, so please go through them. Take up the challenge I gave you on the principles of retention if you just want to figure out, kind of the nuances of how those rules work together. It can get confusing, particularly in Exchange. I'm more a SharePoint person, so I found the Exchange side a little bit more challenging, but all right. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I will keep the show going and turn it over to the next speaker that I believe is going to start in maybe 5 minutes.